You know, Good Friday is just so relevant to everything that we go through because it makes this solid and clear statement that there is suffering in life. And even in these COVID times, perhaps we can relate in even a unique way that there is suffering in life and that God knows that there is suffering. There are three major themes to Good Friday, and the first theme is that God does come into our suffering. And if this is a day where you are really going through a dark time for whatever the reason, Good Friday reminds you and reminds all of us that God knows what you're going through. And the second theme is that God's priority is not the world's priority. When Jesus died on the cross, it turned world truth upside down because it showed that the greatest power in the universe is the love of God. And that love of God that was specifically revealed by Jesus sacrificing himself. That's the greatest power in the world that we remember on Good Friday. And then thirdly, a major theme of Good Friday is that there is hope. And we know that because Jesus had hope as he hung on the cross. And I want to show you why Jesus had that hope as a part of our worship here this morning. The story of Jesus is just an incredible one right from the beginning. Jesus was born in a barn. We celebrate that at Christmas, so that we know that Jesus is among us, not in a palace, but he was born where we are. God knows where we are. Jesus was baptized by John, who we call John the Baptist. John the Baptist grew to be Jesus' dearest friend. And when John the Baptist was executed by King Herod, Jesus knew then the price to pay for standing up for what's right. Because that's why Herod had killed John, for standing up for what was right. And then Jesus was tempted. He was tempted as we are tempted. Jesus was called into a certain mission, and Jesus was tempted not to accept that call. And so when you feel tempted into not accepting the call that you feel that God has for your life, you're in good company because Jesus himself was tempted. Jesus' very first teaching, what we now call the Sermon on the Mount, included the Beatitudes, where Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, not the ambitious. Blessed are the poor, not the wealthy. Blessed are the hungry, not those who are full." Jesus redefined words in his life. He gave us whole new meanings for words, like family. Jesus said family is not just your blood anymore. We are all family. We are all created in the image of the same God. Jesus redefined the word happiness. Because so often we think happiness is found in money. But Jesus said happiness is found in relationships and in community. And on Good Friday, Jesus redefines the word power. Power is not status. Power is not prestige. Power is not higher education. Power is not talent. Power is this love that is willing to give up life so that someone else can live. Power is willing to wash someone else's feet. Power is willing to serve the world. He redefined the word power. I'd like to read for you a passage from Matthew 27, where Jesus takes up his cross. And when we hear this passage, we can imagine the anguish in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane when he says, "Take this cup from me," because Jesus knew what was coming. And then the governor's soldiers took Jesus and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and they put a scarlet robe on him. and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and they mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him. And they took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. Without a doubt, Good Friday is a window into pain. But it's not just a window into Jesus' pain, it's a window into the pain of the world. It's a window that says to all of us, look, God knows that there is pain in the world. We think of today of people who were physically tortured as Jesus was. And some of you read John McCain's book about his time in Japanese POW camps. And he talks about physical torture that he endured. And we think today on this very morning, we're in this worship. There are Christians around the world who are being physically tortured in Sudan, in Iran, in China. It puts our calling as Christians into perspective. We are called to enter into the suffering of the world. Jesus was clear about that. All Jesus' life, he said, here's what I'm going to do. I want you to go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. But we're afraid. We're afraid of the crown of thorns. And we know that even all the suffering that we have today, we confess that pales in comparison to what Jesus did and other people have done, but we're still afraid as we watch Jesus sweat blood. We are drawn to this simple question: what are we willing to give? What are we willing to sacrifice to love the world as Jesus loved the world? If Jesus died on the cross, what's the least that we can do? Or maybe the question is, what's the most that we can do? We continue on in Matthew chapter 27. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." This is such a poignant scene where this Roman centurion, not only was he not a disciple, he was an enemy of Jesus and his people. But the Roman was there and witnessed what Jesus had done on the cross. And somehow he came to believe in that moment and said, surely this was the Son of God. He came to believe before the resurrection. He came to believe before Jesus was raised from the dead. And I think it's because he witnessed this act of sacrificial love. I think all people can see the power when sacrificial love is shared, regardless of their background or race or creed or religion. When someone gives up his or her life for someone else, we see the power in that love. And this Roman centurion, who was not a Jesus follower, exclaimed, surely this is the Son of God. I want to tell you about Burns Macaulay. Do you know who Burns Macaulay is? No, you wouldn't. Burns Macaulay was my foreman when I worked on the CNR out around Jasper in Alberta in the mountain region. Burns Macaulay wasn't just my foreman, though. He was the foreman that oversaw the whole stretch of the railway all the way from Hinton, Alberta, down to Kamloops, BC. There was a day in early May 1982 when I was working on a construction crew of 30 men. And what we were going to do was put a switch into the main line that ran from Hinton down to Hope, BC. And so we took a chunk out of the main railway line to put that switch into, and we had a 2-hour block. That means they give you a certain amount of time to get that switch in because they don't want to be holding up the Via train that's waiting. The Via train's full of paying customers and tourists, and we all knew you do not want to hold up the Via train. But that day was wet and rainy and cold and blowing. We were at the end of a 12-hour shift. There were swarms of black flies and no-see-ums biting at us as we worked. And we realized in time that we weren't going to make it. We weren't going to get that switch in time. And we were starting to panic. And then we looked down the line south, and we saw a rail car speeding toward us. And as it got closer, we saw in that rail car a white hard hat. And we knew it was Burns Macaulay coming. And we thought to ourselves, he is going to skin us alive. Burns Macaulay was a fiery Scotsman. He had forearms like Popeye. He was tougher than a railway spike. And Burns was coming now. And we were late. And the rail car skid to a halt right in front of us, right where that track ended. And he jumped out with his eyes ablazing. And we braced for the onslaught. But what he said to us was this. He said, "We can do this together. We have 30 minutes. Let's do this together, men." And he grabbed a spiking hammer And he went down to where we were working, shoulder to shoulder, hand to hand, and he started spiking into a hardwood switch tie. His arms were moving up and down like pistons. And we were thinking, this is Burns McCauley, who oversees the entire 800-mile district of railway. He doesn't need to be working side by side with us in our cold, in our muck. And the way his hands were working with those ties and that hammer and those spikes, we knew that he had been where we are before. He had come in to our muck and our mire and our cold. He had come in to this swarm of black flies in which we were working. And we got that switch in together. And the Via train went through and the passengers waved us as they went by. And after, he came back to the bunkhouse with us, and he ate with us, and we rested with him. We gained so much respect and love for Burns McCauley that day, because he came into our grief, he came into our struggle, and he helped us shoulder to shoulder. On Good Friday, we are painted a picture of a God who comes into your struggle, a God who comes into your mess and your mud and your mire and your hopelessness. God will come into that part of your life, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, and remind you that you are not alone in that. That even though you walk through the valleys of the shadow of death, God will be with you. His rod and his staff will comfort you. And there is nothing that can separate you from that presence. And after your work is done, he'll go home with you, and he'll eat with you. And there you will find your rest.